Welcome to the 29th meeting for the Wharf project. Today, got some updates on the contract kit and the new command line tool. There's some in-development work happening on the Antelope library, as well as the session kit to kind of tie all three of these things together in a pretty cohesive way. More website updates in progress, which is going to be the case for a while still. And then, yeah, whatever we kind of want to dive into. One of our big pushes right now is to try to get this technical preview and start getting some feedback out about the contract kit. We published this, I believe, I don't think we talked about it last week on the call, but we published it at some point last week, and it's a way to start diving into using the contract kit for table-related stuff and creating actions. On Monday, I want to say it was, we released the command line interface tool that kind of accompanies this now. We'll go over that briefly. I can kind of show it live here in a demo. And then how this is all playing together with the contract kit itself. So I guess just to kind of dive right into things, we can kind of look at the code generation suite of the contract kit. We believe it's in a pretty stable position. We've been using it now for some of our projects, and the session kit is going to start using it a little bit for some unit tests, some like integration tests. There is not a PR outstanding for that yet, but there will be soon. If I flip over to the command line itself, what I did here was just went and made a empty folder. I've already installed the code generator on my machine. Currently, it's going to require Node.js on the machine. If we kind of figure that's reasonable because this is for code generation for working in front-end applications. But if there is a strong enough demand, we can always bundle it up as a binary of some sort using Dino or some other sort of packager. So that way the native system doesn't actually need Node.js installed. It'll be bundled with like a local copy of some sort of JavaScript engine. But for now, the easiest way is just using npm and installing it globally. It'll put it on your command line.
Why use NPX?
What was that?
Use NPX.
We could. Isn't NPX just like a layer on top of npm?
It basically does the same thing, except you don't have to install. You can just call NPX WharfKit and then whatever, and it'll handle all of the installation globally by itself.
Cool. Not opposed. Not incredibly exposed to that. I mean, I've used NPX, but I haven't built anything for it, I guess. I don't know if anybody on our team has. So
you can just change your docs to say use NPX and then the command itself without having to install stuff.
Cool. I'm assuming there's some sort of configuration we'll have to run through to get that to work. Like if I just type it right now, it's not going to work, is it?
Yeah, well.
So if I do npx WharfKit, or do I WharfKit CLI?
Of the commands.
Ah, that's nifty. Had no idea. All right, well, that's an even better option. And I'm assuming it caches a copy, so it's, or does it go out and fetch it every time?
It'll go and install it globally.
Cool. All right, well, we'll update the README because that's just as easy. You can do, I mean, it'll obviously be a little bit longer of a command because it's either npx at WharfKit CLI, or if you install it globally, it's just WharfKit. But either will work. Yeah, we'll have to update the README. That's even easier. So I keep hitting the wrong hotkey. So the point of this tool is for front-end applications to be able to generate code based on their smart contracts or anybody else's smart contracts. And what this does is, well, we can go into what it does. We'll show you kind of how to use it first, because this will give us some example code. So with the WharfKit command, like it says there that generate's the only command it has. So if we use generate, you can see the output syntax, and what it needs is an account name. So just as an example, let's do the token contract. It also needs a path to an API. It's either that, or you could save that in your environmental variables. I will have to put that in the documentation somewhere. Just for the purposes of this demo, though, we'll pull from Jungle and just our API. And if you don't do anything else, well, you got to have the right version of Node. If you don't do anything else, it's just going to output to the command line. This is a whole bunch of TypeScript that the code generation has now made that is a contract instance from the contract kit for that specific API. It's also got a compressed version of the API embedded directly in it for reference purposes. So that way, anytime you're using this contract, you no longer have to call the API or call get API from an API endpoint, which is going to be a fairly massive savings in terms of network requests. Some apps just spam requests to get API, and it is not really that useful. So with this command, you can also output it to a file. So like if we said this was our token contract.typescript, now it just outputs that file. I have a copy or this folder open in Visual Studio. This is the code it outputs. Depending on your TypeScript configuration, it may complain about some things needing to be imported as types only. We might have to figure out a flag for that, so you could like specify. So that way it would change how the code is output. But for now, it'll just output this one variation of the code base. Then within your application, you're obviously going to need some dependencies installed already, which we'll go through in some of those guides and whatnot. But you'll be able to use this contract instance alone to do some fun things with. I wonder if this is going to be smart enough to know, since this is just an empty project.
Maybe I missed it. Is there a way to just have it saved to a location instead of putting to the console?
Yeah, that was this -f flag.
Gotcha.
So, and then also if you are on an OS that has some sort of hotkey or clipboard access, like on Mac, you have PB copy. It'll just dump it directly into your clipboard. So like if I went and I made a new file, just pasted, it just wrote it into my clipboard. So another easy way to get it out of there. You can do directly to console, directly to file, or pipe it out however you want to on your console.
How do you expect developers to be using it? Mostly they'll just be writing to file.
I imagine so. Like you'll be in your project folder. Like if this was one of my projects and I knew I needed to write the file to source contracts, whatever, you could do it from the root. Oh, I guess it's complaining that the folder doesn't exist, but I might have to deal with that. Source contracts. So I expect most people.
Why not make that the default? That it saves to a file instead of console being the default.
It could, but it's still going to require a parameter unless we automatically come up with a file name. Like we could dynamically create a file name, I guess, based on the contract name.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't solve the problem. They're probably going to want to put it into a folder. The expectation would likely be that there's a third parameter there. I agree.
Yeah, some sort of path or something.
It's just, I also agree that the default for a user is probably going to be saving it to file. I can't imagine they're going to want to post it to console very often.
It's true. I mean, I think, maybe I'm abnormal, but I do want to be able to pipe it to console so that way I can put it in my clipboard and then just take it wherever I wanted it to be. So I don't know. We could make it default to file, but again, it's going to need some sort of path anyways. So I yeah, no, I'm curious to know what other people think as well. Like how do you like once people actually start using this, like how do you end up using it and what would make that flow better? Because I think we're just like purely operating off of how we would do it, and that's maybe not normal.
Well, it does go along with the same uh, what I was saying before about NPX. Like it's, I would assume it's likely that a developer would only use this as a one-off, or maybe a couple off, but not something that happens very often unless they update their contract, because it's not something they're going to do every time they open their project.
Yeah, exactly. It's gonna and most likely at some point in the future, it's gonna be part of a like build process that happens. And so at that point, it'll just happen automatically. So yeah, I'm definitely open to feedback. So like once you guys get into it, start using it, let me know what your common usage pattern is, and maybe we can work towards making that the default. Cool, cool. So I kind of jumping back. This is what it would output for the token contract. I'm not entirely sure if this is going to be smart enough. Oh, I guess it is. You can either import the entire namespace if you want access to everything, or there's going to be individual exports. I guess just to kind of collapse this to make it make more sense, or from a high level. You can import any of these from the default namespace. You can get the ABI if you want, or you can get the raw ABI blob if for whatever reason you need that. I don't think you actually would, but I think most developers are going to be pulling out the contract. And if you're working with multiple contracts, you might end up having to, say this is the token contract. Because every export is going to be coming out of contract. Like if you had the MSIG contract generated as well. This obviously doesn't exist, but then you'd be able to work with multiple of these at the same time since they all are just exported as contract. But for this case, we can just have it as contract. At a high level, it's also going to give you the action parameter names. So if you need to write a function in your application, this is just a quick mapping that shows how those would map to each other, which then go into these more generic types. These are equated to closer to JavaScript types. Like a name type is going to be either a string, an int64, or an actual name type. So like if you're using, if you're writing a function that wraps one of these contract functions, you'd use one of these action parameters in order to define the types on your function itself. There are also actual types. If you've used ABI to core, which was one of the old utilities that we provided to help with serialization, this should look very familiar. You can import these from types. So if you want to manually create an action for whatever reason, you could have types included, and then types dot auto completion's not kicking in account, and then you'd be able to do from and build your struct that way. Hopefully that's not as useful or needed anymore, simply because we do have the action call on the contract. And then the last part is just a table map, which we use internally to do table lookups and auto completion. A lot of this you'll notice is stuff that probably developers aren't going to be accessing directly, but we needed to generate code for it to make the IDE smart enough to do auto completion on it. You can see that happening on like action here, where we're using a generic that specifies what the type is going to be, and then typing everything on that. This contract is really just an extension of the base contract that comes from the contract kit that sets a bunch of generic types and auto completion helpers. And then the contract kit also knows that, oh, we have this ABI here that was already included, and so we're going to build the contract with that ABI embedded in it, thus negating any future calls to get ABI, at least for this contract. If you obviously are doing other contracts, they'll be there.
For WharfKit, how much of this is actually imported into the web app that's being deployed?
How much of what do you mean?
Entire namespace are being imported, or is it just a static? Is it just a file to assist the ID? Oh, let me get to the question. The question is, how much of this can be shaken out of the tree, or is all of this going to be embedded and downloaded to the user from the client on the
I
client?
think it's really going to depend on how you import it in your project and how you use it. The minute you start using the contract itself, it's gonna a lot of it's gonna be there, I guess. But you should be able to shake some of it off that you're not using. Like if it's a contract, I don't have exact stats on that, I guess, but we're just getting to the point where this is, I guess, usable. And so we only have like a couple instances.
Here, I see there's like the ABI, which is a blob, and then it's loaded into an ABI as a type.
Say that one more time.
Well, there's possible duplication here, right? So there's the ABI as a blob, which is getting exported. There's the ABI as an ABI type, I'm assuming, which is getting
Yes.
exported. And those are pretty much the same thing, correct?
Yes, but I mean, one's a reference to the other, so I don't think it's gonna like duplicate that blob.
I thought it did generation or something. It actually it just loads it as the blob itself.
That's a good question. I mean, it does convert it into a different type, but the code is the code. So when this is output to JavaScript, it's still going to look very similar to this.
I see.
Like, I guess in memory, there might be duplication of that data, but I imagine...
It's not double downloaded to the client.
Correct. And I like in your application, if you're just importing the contract from the token contract, then in theory, it should just shake most of the other stuff away. I mean, it's going to include the ABI as it builds the contract, but
So that's my question. If there's ever a need to import the full namespace into a web application, or if you're only going to be importing some partial export.
Sorry, I missed the first part of that. It's like right at the beginning, I couldn't hear.
My question is if you only ever need to import that partial, like the contract, or if you need to import the whole entire namespace somewhere when you're interacting with the contract through WharfKit or something.
I think you'll only ever need the contract, really. And
then it should shake everything else.
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, obviously, the blob of the ABI needs to exist in the source code somewhere if you're using this method. It's either, the two options with the contract kit is you generate code like this, and then, the blob is going to be embedded in, and it's going to shake whatever other components off it can. Or you're going to use the contract kit without the code generation, and then it's going to make every client call the ABI from an API endpoint every time the client loads.
Which is way worse.
Yeah. Especially considering most... What was that?
And also the current standard.
Yeah. And most don't even use get raw ABI. They use get ABI, which is like even worse. There's like layers of bad on how we do things today. It's nobody's fault. It's just the way that we've settled into doing things. Cool. I will be very interested to see how, when people start bundling this into their applications, like what sort of impacts this kind of thing is going to have, and if there are any problems shaking some of the code out. I do think that when you look at the totality of everything Wharf related, like these little, like this contract file, which is, I don't know, let's look, how big is this thing? Almost 5 kilobytes. That is tiny compared to a lot of the other things we're forcing the users to download in the client. Like some of the compression stuff, some of the cryptography libraries, and all that other stuff. I mean, Wharf itself is 100 times bigger than that. And obviously, none of this is compressed. So that's another factor to take into consideration.
I had asked a while ago, but I'm guessing the numbers have changed. Do you have any idea what the minified size of this is? With an example, EOS token contract.
I don't off the top of my head. I mean, we could generate, if we're talking about the generated contract, we could just make one real quick and find out.
I think it's pretty small. Like you had mentioned, this is 5 kilobytes uncompressed.
Yeah.
It'd be like a kilobyte.
Yeah, it'll compress pretty well. Well, the ABI blob itself is already compressed, so I don't know how well it's going to compress further, but
That's interesting.
yeah. I don't know. I don't know of something. I mean, I suppose I could just gzip it and find out, but
interesting to do a comparison of it versus other typical Web3 libraries.
yeah, I agree. And there's a lot, like, what is it, Elliptic, that is kind of one of the elephants in this whole package. There's some alternatives that exist out there, but I don't think have been completely vetted. So there's definitely some huge cost savings to be made over time, but for right now, I know that most of these packages are huge.
Yeah, the Web3, for instance, is fantastically large.
Yeah. And any application that is going to be doing some partial migration where they're using both Wharf and some older code that still uses EOS.js, like there's going to be some significant overlap and duplication there as well, adding a couple 100 kilobytes of uncompressed code. So it's going to be a little bit of a road to do some cleanup. All right. So this we want people to be trying out, just because we know there's probably going to be some edge cases where, when you go out and generate a contract for whatever it is that you've built in the past, or you're working on right now, something may not be converted correctly from the ABI that we're pulling from the token or from the contract into the TypeScript code itself. We're fully ready for people to submit those reports. You just basically got to let us know what the contract was that didn't work, and then we can regenerate it as well, so long as it's deployed on a blockchain somewhere. And then we should be able to help debug that and find these edge cases and help this move forward. I don't really have a great testing in. Sorry?
I was going to say that's a great question. What about ones that aren't deployed to a blockchain? Is it still possible using a local smart contract?
Not yet. It should be possible, but the command line tool is not wired up to read locally. Maybe it should be, but currently,
it would just need an ABI, yeah?
Yeah. Currently, it's just fetching from the API itself, though. So I think we could probably make it work so that way it didn't have to make the call.
It just does an FS, like a file system call.
Yeah. And I know we have it working. It's just, like I said, not wired up. For our unit tests throughout this whole thing, we have it so that it's reading ABIs locally. Like you can see data ABIs. Like we're just reading the ABIs locally when we're doing unit tests. It's just this command line interface isn't hooked up to do it. So we should be able to add a feature where you could just specify a JSON file, and then it would interpret the JSON file and output the code. Because this is all we need is the ABI itself as JSON.
Simple.
Yeah, it shouldn't be too hard to add as a feature. We'll have to add some sort of switching on the context or something. I don't know. We'll get into that later. Cool. And then when you're actually using this thing, you would use this contract object in an identical way that you would be using the generated version. Like if we were over on the website, anything that's in this loading contracts guide, you would not use the contract kit. It would be this resulting contract right here. When you called contract kit.load EOSIO token, this contract would be identical to the generated version. It's just this version is going to go out and make API calls to dynamically populate itself. And this version in the dynamic mode will not have all of the friendly auto completion and typing and some of the other things. But any of the other methods from this guide where you're reading data and this guide where you're creating actions will work with the generated contract right here. All it's really doing, you can kind of see here's the action call. It's the same thing. It's calling its parent class with action. It's just wrapping a whole bunch of generic types around everything to improve that experience. That way it's going to autocomplete for you, and it's going to know what types of variables you need to input into these various things. So if you read a guide about reading tables, it'll work both in the dynamic and the code generation environment at the same time.
So you wouldn't actually ever have to do contract equals something. You just import that contract into the exported from the namespace.
Yep. It already exists. So if you want to go out and get some other contract, you can always load it. Or if you want to generate it in advance, that's what this command line tool is for right now. In the future, we're also talking, one of the requests has been that we have something in Anchor to help upload contracts. This command line tool, we might add contract uploading functionality too, and try to maybe supplement some of the stuff that you would otherwise use Kleos or Anchor or some web interface for. A lot of people have run into issues where they want to push a contract on chain and like Anchor's payload specification doesn't allow a certain size over a certain size. And so they run into errors, or maybe the website's having issues with URL sizes. It's just a lot of weirdness sometimes around uploading contracts when you're not using Kleos. So this command line tool might eventually turn into a tool that can also help with that. We can then kind of address some of those size issues just by reading things locally and passing things locally. So that's future pipe dream, but that's why we also moved this command line tool out of the contract kit and into a standalone thing. So that way we can just add more not contract kit related tools into the command line utility while still having access to that kind of functionality specifically for the contract kit. So
you don't still have to instantiate the contract though. You don't have to like pass it WharfKit instance.
You do. Like in with the example I was kind of starting to write, you would instantiate talking and typing at the same time. You would instantiate it, and then you'd also pass an API client of something.
I see.
So, and if you were doing like this is the import method, and if you were doing the dynamic method, it'd be import contract kit from WharfKit contract, and then you would set up the kit, contract kit, and then you pass the client, which is another API client, and then you'd use, look at that. I don't know if that's wrong. Copilot was almost right. So it's the same thing. Like this is the dynamic world. I can type.
You should have called it contract. Copilot was trying to give you suggestions.
Yep. So yeah, these are the variants, and then they're going to both behave identically because they're both derived from the same class. So
Nothing here is just for explanation. You usually have a client already instantiated somewhere before it, which should be passing in here.
Yeah. And if you have a session already, like you have a user that's logged in, you can do session.client. and just pass in the client from the session. Or maybe you have a global client or a global API client that you could just pass in. That's kind of been best practices in a lot of our applications is we just have like an API client already defined based on whatever the application's doing. And then whenever we instantiate a new session, we just
Sure.
pass it in.
Because you want to be able to fetch stuff without having a user logged in anyway.
Yep, exactly. You need to kind of know which blockchain you're working with so you know which API endpoints are defined. But otherwise, the client is a client. It's kind of generic. At least right now, there's some changes coming with that. Which I guess to touch on briefly, I mentioned this in the Telegram channel, but we are really looking into this what we've been using as an API client for a while now. And there might become chain specific versions of API clients. Like there might eventually be a Wax API client and a Leap API client and a Telos API client. And that's due to the fact that they respond to APIs differently. Like both Telos and Wax, when you call, if you're to do client chain get account, this response for Leap, just generic default system contracts, which is kind of, I guess, what EOS runs, is going to have one set of data. But as soon as you call this on Wax or Telos, there is new data that comes back out of here that is based on the system contract. This API call is very non-standard and has caused some headaches with how this is designed. So we're going to make it most likely so that if you use a Wax client, you will get the proper response here. I don't know if same with if you use Telos and then the generic one will be the Leap API client. There's
work with the others, but it
yes.
just won't have piped data for it.
Yeah, I can kind of, where's my browser? There it is. We've started on these. These don't work quite yet. If I open up the Leap and the Wax, the Leap one, this one's going to have all the generic, like this is baseline for every chain. And then what these other clients do, they're really tiny. They just override methods on it. So you can see like this is the get account call in the Wax client. And what we're changing is the response type. So the response type, and even those response types are fractions of what they need to be. And all it does is it extends the actual Leap implementation and then declares these 4 new fields. And the same with the Wax account object is a base account object that extends and adds this. So it's kind of working right now, but we're having a lot of problems with detecting and making it intuitive to use. So I don't know where this is going. It's actually taken up a lot of time over the last week and slightly concerned at this point with how much time we're spending on API client abstraction and with it potentially getting in the way of other things that we're doing. So I make no promises that this will be out soon, but it is something we're like actively trying to find a solution for, at least right now.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's pretty annoying.
Yeah. So yeah, there's been a lot of internal discussions happening, and I don't need to take up a ton of our time on this call to address that, but we're working on it. I guess kind of looping back to the contract there, we said, I think in Telegram that the 0.4.2 release is out. There will be an update to the session kit here soon. It's going to be a 1.1 release, and the goal of the 1.1 release is to integrate the session or the contract kit, the 0.4.2 release of that. So you'll have compatibility. I don't think, no, none of the changes are live yet. What it's going to do is there's going to be a bunch of ways that when you're setting up the session kit, I guess this is as good as example as any. So let's say you're using the session kit and you've got new session kit and you're setting things up. What you're going to be able to do with all the other options is you're going to say contracts, and you're going to be able to pass in contracts. And this will pre-cache any either dynamic or statically generated contracts from the contract kit into the session kit, so it's aware of them all. So it'll cache the ABIs, it'll make it so that they're accessible from the session, and it'll just kind of do some other helpful things. It's not going to be a requirement. You're not going to have to do this. You'll still be able to just, like, if you have a session, this is your new session with your parameters. When you pass in a contract action, like this is, I know I'm kind of getting in the weeds a little bit. Contract action transfer. Yeah, go Copilot, do your thing. Love it.
Yeah. Modern development
is it's crazy that it's like I'm one of the only, there's a couple people, but I'm one of the only people in the world that's been writing this code, and Copilot's just like, oh yeah, you're that guy. Anyways, when you're signing it, when you're doing a transaction, if you were to pass in this action from the contract generator, like this is really all that you'll need to do. You don't need to pass anything into the session kit. What we're doing is we're actually embedding the information needed for the call, like the ABI, into the action. And then when the session kit receives it through a transact call, it knows how to deserialize and handle that action. If you were just to pass in JSON here, though, this call will make a call to the get ABI endpoint and need to go out and understand the JSON that you just wrote in here. So there is a pretty big performance benefit to actually using the contract itself, like the contract instance, to create your actions. Because then, like, this is like passively being optimized through the contract kit. So there's a lot of
why if this is a case where contract is instantiated from the local generation, why can't you just contract.transfer?
So instead of calling .action, is that what you're saying? We could, and we've talked about, I think one of our really early versions had that, but we followed this convention because there could be naming conflicts. Like, what if there's a table called transfer? Our table syntax is table.
I guess there's also dots in some of the action names.
That's true. Like some of the power-up ones, I think, have dots. But we did this for tables, and then we just decided to use the same syntax for action. But you're right, it could just be contract.transfer. But if there's a dot in there, it's going to get all wacky. We'll have to do some like string substitution there. But yeah, the original example I had was if there's an action called transfer and a table called transfer, then
right,
they were both, yeah, you get it.
Okay. So,
yeah, but syntax feedback like that, we are 1000% open to. Like, as people start using it and experiencing what it feels like to work with this, if there's ways that we can make it better, I'm all for it. Because we've talked about a lot of that internally, and it, not all of that's been communicated outwards just because there's so much going on. But there's obviously things we haven't thought about. It would be impossible for us to have considered at all.
The reason I was asking was that a nice syntax might be, for instance, contract.actions.transfer, and then you open a parentheses and it gives you typed like IDE, what's it called? IntelliSense.
Yeah.
It would tell you like from, to, quantity, and memo.
Are you talking? Are you talking about having them like as named parameters? Like if I did, we're just going to do transfer here. Like this, yeah, like Copilot just wanted to do.
Exactly, yeah.
As opposed to an object.
as opposed to an object. Well, not as opposed to. It doesn't have to be as opposed to. It could be optionally. Like you could either pass it in like this as an action transfer with an object, or you could do contract.actions.transfer and then have all of
Right.
the code completion stuff.
Let me pull in a different window here, someplace that's actually going to have a functional TypeScript code base.
The reason I'm asking is that the EOS.js version 1 actually did it like that, and it was a really nice way to go about it. So Ethers, JS, Web3, they all do that same kind of methodology. It's a little bit, I wouldn't say standard, but expected in smart contract web development.
Yeah, and we do like, okay, so I'm in the session kit right now. I'm in the unit tests, and I have a code generated contract here. It's kind of exactly what we were doing in the other window. You can see we have like TypeScript validation happening on this object. If you use auto completion, like it's showing you the fields. So like, let me turn off Copilot for a second. Copilot's smart, but I don't want to show Copilot right now. So, okay, Copilot's not suggesting, but if you do use the IDE's auto completion feature, it's going to know what's missing. And then it's going to know, I believe, what data types, or it should. Oh, it does say over there. It does say name type. So it's going to want like a string to someone. And then it wants quantity. And that can either be a string or an actual asset. And then it wants, oh, I didn't do a comma. And then it's a memo. I agree. It might be nice if like you could just have them as named parameters. And maybe we could do that in the code generation world.
As long as it still gives some kind of intelligence for what parameters are there, that's fine. It's perfect.
Yeah. And it's also going to know like, so opening up a new token contract and then doing action. When you open it, like it tells you the strings that are possible right there. So I can do, I guess it's even showing you the actions that you could all complete. And then when you actually select the string, the generic, like you can see the data type up there knows that it's a transfer parameter. If I went over and changed this to open, now it's a EOS.io token open action parameter. And this should know, yeah. So it wants owner, RAM payer, and symbol, which don't need quotes, but RAM payer and symbol.
It's hard coding without Copilot.
Yep. And I guess another way would be to do, if you wanted to do data, and then you said this was EOS.io token action params open. And now this object is, it knows what it needs because this is a type definition for that specific entry. So, and then that could obviously just go in there once it's filled out. So yeah, we have a little bit of that, but the named parameters could also be interesting. What it would do though is just require in here, we'd have to define all those actions. Like it would just be, there'd be a close and a create. And so there would be another method added for every single action in the contract, which would increase the file size, but might be nice for developers. Yeah, it's a balancing act.
Yeah. Especially since that specifically wouldn't be shaked out of the tree.
Yeah, I don't think it would be. Not for class methods. If you included the class, it would be there. I suppose maybe there's an option to actually just make functions in the namespace and do more functional programming, and those could be shaken out. But
another time, later, problem for later.
Yeah. No, now I'm just thinking about having like an actions namespace with a bunch of functions that's just functional programming. Like that could be a route to go too. We'll look at that in the future.
What's the options there for an action?
Those are, I believe, things that you could pass into. Actually, I could just go to the contract kit. I think right now it's only authorization. The way that these things work is that you can generate actions without knowing the account. That's the CLI. So what it does is it uses placeholder actions. Go to contract action. That's not helpful. Action options. Yeah, right now it's just an authorization. It's going to be ways that will help you template that transaction. Placeholders are kind of like, if you know ESR, you've probably worked with placeholders in the past. But as we generate actions, we are using, like, anytime you make an action, we're just inserting a placeholder auth, which is something that ESR had that is an invalid name that we can detect. And then what happens is
Lots of dots.
Yeah. Yep. It's a valid name, like symbol in terms of like the system, but it's not valid on chain. At least I don't think it is. And then the session kit templates those in because the session kit knows who the account is, but the contract kit does not. So if you explicitly wanted to state an authority for a transaction, you could pass it in as the options, and then you can see here we would overwrite the placeholder with the option. So yeah, there's a couple other methods we haven't talked, but and if there's like, as people start using that action method, if there are ways you want to use it that is not possible right now that we just haven't figured out, we can always add additional options to that to customize the behavior of the action creation. Yeah. There's
also the option here if somebody prefers to use, let's say, a dot actions notation instead of the object notation, then you could really just transform that output contract. It's not like you have to have both. It's unlikely a developer will use both. They'd likely prefer one.
Yeah, that's very true.
Something for later.
Yeah, there's a lot of directions we can go kind of after this, but hopefully this is the solid foundation that we can like start from. Like, we're just trying to make that stable so that way we can figure out whatever is going to come next once people actually start using this and integrating this into their applications. That's kind of where our focus is starting to move right now too, is like we have, I know I've mentioned it before, but an active Unicode branch that we're like starting to move all of our code over to use Wharf now, including the contract kit at this point, where every action that Unicode performs will go through a statically generated contract instance. And every table call is going to go through the table syntax. All of the transactions will go through the session kit. Like, we're really going to dog food this. And I know Unicode is a very limited subset of functionality of these blockchains, but it at least gives us exposure to using these things. So as other people do that and give us that feedback about what works, what doesn't work, we can reach some middle ground to continue building on this thing. So yeah, we are bumping up against our hour mark, and people, I'm assuming, will have meetings and need to bounce here soon. Is there anything we want to cover in the last couple minutes?
Some chat about the scatter APIs and wallets that we're still using them again. Somebody was talking about, I can't remember, maybe Monkey.
Yep.
Was there any resolution to that? I lost the thread.
It's still ongoing. We did release a Wombat plugin that uses the scatter protocols. It is functioning. Since then, that was like I think last week, maybe the week before. Time is, anyways. Um, we have now also found that Token Pocket, their Android version apparently still works with EOS and Wax, but their iOS one does not. So we have kind of a Token Pocket plugin that is in the pipeline. And then just this morning, one of our developers said that he finally got the plugin working with the old version of Scatter, the latest version of Scatter. So we might actually release a Scatter
Version of
plugin.
Works, period. Jeez.
Yep. So we're making progress on that, and it'll probably result in 3 or more individual plugins that all share the same code base. So, but at least they'll be branded.
Gotcha. No, is it like one actual plugin with then a couple of children, like a parent and then some children, or are they just like duplicated code basically?
That's the goal, is to have them all extend one common code base. Right now they are just duplicated. We just, now that just as of today, we got kind of the last little bits working. Now it's where we need to pull all the code out and make like a shared library that they'll all pull from. And that way we're not duplicating all that code over and over again.
I'm sorry.
It's all good. I mean, if we had like months to devote to that, we could probably pull EOS.js out and kind of, I think we would have to recreate Scatter.js using the Antelope library, but that would be the only way to really slim this down, and that's a lot of effort. So I don't.
I think luckily you should really only have to replicate the embedded one. I don't think anybody used the socket because that one was really complicated. And recreating that would not be fun.
Yeah. Yeah. So we just have it embedded in there and it's working. Right now it's kind of like if you add any of those plugins, you're going to add some heft to your package size. But that's just because this is as far as we could get it in the time we allocated to it. So
what added heft?
EOS.js and its dependencies that are different than the Antelope library and its dependencies.
Was it injecting EOS.js into the client?
Yes. Everything needed to be
fun.
in EOS.js format. So it's pulling in EOS.js and all of its dependencies. And yeah.
I recall it only injecting a signature provider.
Maybe it'll shake decently. We'll have to see. I know.
Yes, maybe I don't remember correctly.
No, I know I've seen the development package size and it's fairly large, but it'll be interesting. I guess maybe I need to add that to Unicode and just see how much the file size goes up. See how much like an actual packaged product can shake out of it.
I mean, in any case, the concepts are wildly different. Even if it was only importing a signature provider, that's not usable.
Yeah.
Inside WharfKit.
Yeah. Yep, good stuff. Sorry, I get briefly interrupted. Yeah, I guess we can kind of wrap it up here unless there's anything else. I'm not in a rush to go anywhere, but I don't also want to keep people here if people need to go do other things.
I do have 3 minutes until my next call, so I appreciate it.
All right. Well, then let's wrap it up here. Thank you guys for joining.